Villa Chateau de Montsoro towered over the Loire River, surrounded by dense trees that made it feel secluded and confined. Alexandra stopped the car at the wrought iron gates and looked up at the building and felt a slight tension. The castle was majestic, but within its walls there was an oppressive silence, as if the place itself had long since forgotten what it meant to be alive. She had come here at the invitation of the owners to conduct a restoration of the castle and its unique mirrors, which were rumored to be of great historical value. Such projects were rare in her profession. Working with ancient sites that could tell hundreds of stories was her dream. But something about this place was already unsettling from the very beginning. Alexandra got out of the car, grabbed her bag of tools, and headed for the gate. She expected to see some of the maintenance staff, or at least a guard, but the castle greeted her with complete silence. There was almost no wind, and the shadows from the trees seemed especially thick, as if the trees themselves didn't want to let the light out. She was met on the threshold by an old man, the manager of the castle, who seemed to have lived here forever. He introduced himself as Mr. Leroux and briefly outlined the tasks facing Alexandra. She listened attentively, but could not shake the feeling that the villa hid something behind its old stone walls. "Everything is quiet here," Mr. Leroux said, his voice sounding like an echo of bygone centuries. "But be careful. The castle has a life of its own." These words sounded strange, but Alexandra decided not to focus on them. She had already worked in ancient buildings that seemed alive, but it was always just a game of imagination. Inside the castle, she was immediately struck by the mirrors. They hung in every corner, on every floor, reflecting light in such a way that it seemed as if space was being stretched and compressed at the same time. These mirrors were an important part of the castle's history. According to legend, they were custom made by a wealthy family in the 17th century, and there have been many legends surrounding them ever since. It was said that they could see more than just a reflection. Alexandra began to look around one of the large halls. She was to make her first inspection of the mirrors this day, to get a sense of the amount of work involved. She had seen many antique mirrors before, but these were special. The frames of the mirrors were decorated with strange symbols that seemed to have been inscribed for some special purpose. As Alexandra approached one of the mirrors, she felt a chill run down her spine. Her own reflection looked a little strange. It moved a little slower than it should have, as if it was lingering for a moment before repeating her movements. She shook her head, writing it off as tiredness from the road. "Strange," she muttered, touching the cold surface of the mirror. Soon, her assistant, Julienne, who had also noticed something unusual about the mirrors, came over. They began discussing the work plan and tasks for the next few days. Alexandra made some notes in her notebook, but couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone was watching her. "Do you feel it too?" Julian asked, looking back at the mirrors. "I don't know," she answered, "but something is wrong with this place." They continued their inspection, gradually moving around the castle, discussing the details of the restoration. But with each step, the tension in the air became more palpable. It was as if the castle really lived its own life, and Alexandra could not escape the feeling that the mirrors were its eyes. For the night, she stayed in one of the guest rooms on the second floor. The room, like the others, had a large mirror. Before going to bed, she stared into it for a long time. Her reflection stared back, but something about it seemed unnatural, as if it wasn't her, but someone else who was mimicking her movements with a slight delay. She quickly closed her eyes, trying to get rid of this strange sensation, and soon fell asleep. But even in her sleep, it seemed to her that the mirror kept looking at her. The next morning, Alexandra woke up with a heaviness in her head. Her sleep was restless, and the strange feeling that she was being watched never left her. She recalled fragments of dreams in which her reflection in the mirror not only moved on its own, but followed her as if it were someone else's gaze. Gathering her thoughts, she decided to get to work. She had a long day of exploring the castle ahead of her, but before that, she decided to take a closer look at the history of the place, because every object she took on hid its own unique secret. Alexandra knew that knowledge of the castle's past could give her insight into the strange phenomena that had begun to occur. In the castle library, she found an old diary hidden among the dusty books on the top shelf. The cover was faded, the pages yellowed with time, but the text inside was remarkably well preserved. This diary had belonged to Chateau de Montsoro, one of the last owners of the castle. Flipping through the pages, Alexandra came across entries about mirrors. They said that the mirrors had been commissioned by the family in the 17th century, but they weren't just decoration. Mirrors, according to Mark, were meant to protect the house, and he described them as eyes that could see more than humans could. The records also said that one of the mirrors, the largest, was at the center of secret events. "What are these strange eyes?" Alexandra muttered, immersing herself in the reading. The diary mentioned that at some point, the Montsoro family had begun to notice strange phenomena. Disappearing objects, footsteps no one heard, and reflections that didn't always match reality. This was especially true of the main mirror in the large living room. The more she read, the more she became immersed in this strange past. The diary ended with the cryptic phrase, "Mirrors take those who dare to look at them too long." Alexandra felt a shiver. Her heart beat faster as she looked at the ancient mirrors that surrounded her on all sides in the library. Were these legends true? Or were they just fictions of the past? With these thoughts, she walked out of the library and headed for the large mirror in the main living room that had been written about in her diary. It was huge, taking up almost the entire wall. As she approached it, she felt the coldness that came from the surface of the mirror. Again, her reflection seemed strange, a slight slowing down, as if someone was playing with reality. "It's just my imagination," she said to herself, but her voice sounded uncertain. At that moment, Julian came up. He too looked puzzled. "I found another old document," he said, handing her a piece of paper. "It's some kind of drawing. Something to do with mirrors, I think." Alexandra scrutinized the drawing. It was a plan of the layout of the mirrors in the castle, and they were all connected by lines. There was a strange symbolism drawn in the center that she hadn't seen before. It was like a magical net linking all the mirrors together. "They're not just decorative," she said. realizing the importance of the drawing. "They're not just mirrors." Julienne nodded, agreeing. Something about this castle was really wrong. The deeper they delved into its history, the more they sensed an unseen presence. They decided to continue exploring, but each step was getting harder and harder. Alexandra felt her mind begin to get confused with each look in the mirror. It was as if the mirrors were trying to pull her into themselves. But she couldn't stop. Something about this place was pulling her further and further away. As the days passed, Alexandra delved deeper and deeper into the mysteries of the castle. The more she studied its history in mirrors, the more she felt herself becoming part of something much older and more sinister. The legends described in the diaries no longer seemed like mere fiction. The castle lived its own life, and the mirrors were its eyes. On the third day, something strange happened. Julienne, her assistant, suddenly disappeared. They had been working together in the living room where the large mirror was located. But when Alexandra returned after a short break, Julienne was gone. His belongings were still there, but he himself had disappeared without a trace. Alexandra searched the entire castle, calling his name, but her answer was only the empty echo of the old corridors. The sense of unease was growing. She returned to the mirror where they had been working before Julienne's disappearance and took a long look at her reflection. This time, she noticed something quite unnatural. Her reflection didn't just linger. It seemed to stare back at her with some intent, as if it were alive. She took a step closer and, without taking her eyes off the mirror, felt the coldness penetrate her to the bone. Her reflection smiled slightly, though she wasn't smiling herself. Alexandra recoiled sharply, her heart beating faster. It wasn't just a trick of the eye anymore. The mirrors in this house really did have power. That night, lying in bed, she couldn't sleep. Thoughts of Julienne never left her. Suddenly, she felt uneasy when she noticed that the mirror in her room seemed to glow. Her mind was playing tricks on her, but she couldn't look away. For a moment, she thought she saw Julienne in the depths of the mirror, but it was more of a distorted reflection of him, and he was looking back at her with the same strange smile. What if he really is in the mirror? This thought flashed through her mind, and Alexandra jumped up from the bed. She walked over to the mirror, her heart pounding in her chest. She touched the cold surface, and for a moment she thought her hand was passing through the glass as if it were made of water. But then reality returned, and she quickly yanked her hand away. Everything around her became even more ominous. The mirrors were no longer simple objects. They were portals connecting two worlds, and she found herself on the verge of crossing them. The next morning, she made the decision to continue exploring the mirrors. She felt that the solution to Julienne's disappearance lay in these strange mirrors. As she approached the large mirror in the living room, she saw her reflection again. But now it looked different. It was watching her, as if waiting for her to make a mistake. Her reflection took a step forward, though she stood still. Alexandra froze, her breathing quickening. The reflection approached the very edge of the mirror, and for a moment, she thought it was about to step out of it. Her mind resisted, but the mirrors increasingly took over her thoughts. They didn't just reflect, they manipulated reality, creating a world of their own that you could enter if you looked long enough. The night found Alexandra unprepared again. She couldn't get rid of the reflections that were behaving strangely and Julian's disappearance. Her thoughts swirled around the mirrors, and the feeling that something had gone wrong haunted her every moment. The castle, with its mysterious corridors and heavy silences, was beginning to resemble a trap from which there was no escape. Before going to bed, Alexandra took a long look at the mirror in her room. It was opposite her bed, and as soon as she looked into it, it seemed to her that the shadows around her grew thicker, as if something had appeared in the reflection. She knew she shouldn't look in mirrors for long, especially after what she'd read in the journals, but she couldn't stop. Her own reflection seemed unnatural, as if another power lived in it. Suddenly, the reflection began to move faster than she herself. Alexandra abruptly recoiled from the mirror, feeling a chill run through her body. This was more than just a play of light. The mirror changed her reality, pulling her mind inward. She closed her eyes, trying to calm herself, but when she looked at the mirror again, her reflection no longer followed her movements. It stood motionless, as if waiting for something. At that moment, Alexandra realized it wasn't just a reflection. It was a shadow that was waiting for its moment to go beyond the glass. "Who are you?" she whispered, addressing herself. But the shadow in the mirror did not answer. It just stood there, as if it were a living thing that had just realized its existence. Alexandra knew this was not normal. She took a step back, but her legs refused to move. Everything in her body froze, as if she was paralyzed by this eerie sight. Then the shadow took the first step. Alexandra saw her reflection move, though she herself stood still. The shadow approached the edge of the mirror, its eyes glittering in the semi-darkness, and there was something cold and lifeless in them, as if it were looking directly into her soul. Unable to bear it, Alexandra tore toward the door, trying to escape. But when she looked back, the shadow was almost touching the edge of the mirror, ready to break free. The door appeared to be locked. Alexandra began desperately searching for her keys as the cold fingers of fear clutched her heart. She knew that if the shadow came out, it would be the end. The end of her reality, her life, her essence. The mirror would become a gateway to something else, something unimaginably dark. Suddenly, the mirror glowed with a bright, cold light. Alexandra froze, her consciousness blurred. She fell to her knees, feeling her entire reality distort. At that moment, she thought she saw Julien. His silhouette flickered in the depths of the mirror, but it was no longer human. His eyes, too, glowed with that cold light. Her last effort to grab the doorknob was unsuccessful. Her shadow, which had emerged from the mirror, finally touched her shoulder. The touch was cold, but it was the last thing she felt before reality completely collapsed. Alexandra couldn't realize how long she had been on the floor. The room seemed to spin around her, and her mind became more and more confused. After the shadow in the mirror touched her, reality began to blur, as if her mind was immersed in a dream. But this dream was all too real. Her thoughts darted around, trying to latch onto anything familiar, but nothing seemed solid. The faint light from the mirror began to flicker again, and Alexandra struggled to rise and looked at her reflection. Now she was sure it was no longer her. The shadow that came out of the mirror looked like her, but its eyes were empty, and its movements were abrupt and unnatural. "You're not here anymore," her reflection said, though she didn't open her mouth. The voice sounded muffled, as if it came from somewhere deep underground. Alexandra started to back away, but realized there was nowhere to retreat to. Her consciousness shrank, as if the entire space of the castle had shrunk, and the air had become dense, robbing her of her ability to breathe. She felt like a bird in a cage, with no way out. "You must choose," the shadow continued, moving closer to her. "Either you stay here forever, like me, or you become part of the world beyond the mirror." Alexandra squeezed her eyes shut, unable to look at this creature that claimed her life. Memories flashed through her mind, of Julienne, of her life before the castle, of how she herself had come here, unaware that this project would become a trap for her mind. Opening her eyes was scary, but she knew she had to do it. When she looked at the mirror again, her shadow was already right in front of her. She extended her hand, inviting her to make a choice. "What happens if I refuse?" Alexandra asked, trying to maintain the remnants of her composure. The shadow froze for a moment. Then its lips curved back into a strange smile. "If you refuse, you will stay here, forever. And every time you look in the mirror, you won't see yourself, but me." That answer was unbearable. Alexandra realized there was no way out. The world beyond the mirror beckoned her with its unknown, but that meant losing herself completely. If she stayed, she would be forever stuck in this nightmare where her reality would be completely shattered. In desperation, she took a step forward, keeping her eyes on the shadow that looked as if it had been expecting this. Her hand slowly rose to touch the mirror, but at the last moment, she froze. The choice seemed impossible. Oblivion on one side and the unknown on the other. Her heart beat faster, and she suddenly felt a strange calmness. Regardless of the choice, she knew her old life would never return. But perhaps in the world beyond the mirror, she could find answers. Find Julienne, or at least understand what had become of her. With all her will in her fist, she touched the mirror. The surface was as cold and malleable as water. Her hand began to sink in, and she felt something pulling her in, as if her essence was beginning to dissolve into that cold light. The last thing she saw was her own reflection, a shadow that was now smiling at her like an old friend who had finally gotten his way.